Good morning, everybody, once again. Welcome to this plenary session. As you might have seen in the program, this plenary session is titled, What Role for Civil Society in Enhancing Agricultural Policy? I think this should be an interesting session or an interesting plenary, because civil society is always associated with all the troubles. So I'm sure we will get a glimpse of the troubles associated with the civil society. This plenary session is very critical because, as you know, CADAP has identified civil society as one of the critical partners in trying to achieve the fundamental agricultural transformation. And as you know, civil society itself always claims a number of laws which can be summed up together as a watchdog law. And I think it would be interesting to hear from civil society activists themselves about how they perceive their own roles. But with particular regard to this session, we'll be considering one critical question, which is whether the African civil society is in a position to play its role as advocated by CADAP. As advocated by CADAP. Broadly speaking, we can identify two laws for civil society in as far as the agricultural policy making processes are concerned. Firstly, it can engage in dialogue, policy dialogue, which is the role that CADAP has specifically outlined for civil society. But more importantly, civil society can play a mobilization role, mobilizing the rural farmers out there to demand good agricultural policies. And basically, this is the role that most civil society organizations are used to. And in order to discuss this very important question, we have assembled a high-profile panel. I have with me Fatima Shabodien, who is the country director for ActionAid in South Africa, and she has a long history of political activism from a feminist point of view. And then we have Tamani Nkhono Mvula, who has dedicated his whole life working in the civil society. He is the national coordinator for the civil society network on agriculture in Malawi. And then we have Dr. Augustin Loada, who is a political science and law professor at the University of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, and he has many years of experience in doing research from a political economy perspective within the agricultural sector. And last but not least, as a learning continent, because I think we cannot discuss this important topic without having some measure of learning, we have with us Dr. Arilson Favareto, who is a professor at the Federal University of ABC region in Brazil and a researcher at the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning. And basically, he works on rural development, public policies, and rural social movements. So as a learning continent, we thought it wise that we cannot discuss this important topic without making some efforts to learn from other parts of the world where they have probably succeeded. We are going to proceed as follows. Each of these panels will be given 5 minutes to make their opening remarks. And then we'll have a set of questions that I will engage with the panelists. And after that, we'll open it up for discussion. And at this point in time, I'd like to ask Fatima to make her opening remarks.
Good morning. I've decided I'm going to use my 5 minutes to make only 3 points. The first point I want to talk about is who leads the policy engagement processes on behalf of civil society. The second point is about the process of policy engagement, and the last point is about the content of that policy discussion. So for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to define civil society only as NGOs and movements engaged in the agrarian reform sector. And the reason why I think it's important to distinguish is precisely because I think when it comes to leadership in the policy discussion, it is largely the NGOs who dominate that process, and it's problematic for a whole host of reasons. I think we know, and our governments know, the people whose decisions we want to influence know the limitations on the power of NGOs to lead long-term sustainable change. I don't think the penny has dropped for NGOs yet. So I think it's important that we argue very strongly that NGOs are a legitimate expression of civil society. So we do see an important role for ourselves, but we have to understand the limitations to the political power of NGOs, and that we need to redefine ourselves largely as a support mechanism for building social movements in our countries. I think many NGOs exist without making any contribution to this at all, and that we're quite comfortable in that space, which in part accounts for the lack of transformation in this crucial area in most of our countries. So NGOs have to take up that space not only to build social movements, but to support them in that process. The second point I'm making is about the actual process of policy engagement. So by and large, the methodology is quite alienating to the people we are talking about. So there's a lot of problematizing the lack of policy engagement skills on the part of small-scale farmers or agricultural workers and donors and NGOs. We invest extensively in capacitating people to be able to participate in that policy conversation without saying, actually, hold on, why don't we look at how this discussion proceeds, and problematize in a fundamental way the language of that, the process, the methodology, and so on. Because as it stands, existing policy discussions privileges the voices of elites, which is why when we have those policy conversations, certainly in my country here in South Africa, the arena is dominated by commercial agriculture, and when it's small-scale farmers, it's men who are doing the talking. So the very people whose voices we want to hear actually don't get a space in that process. And I think here academics have an important contribution to make in helping us figure out an alternative way of having that conversation in a way that places farmers at the center. So while I'm busy with academics, and we have so many in the room, I do think there's something to be said about the way agricultural research takes place by and large. So my experience is that it's by and large been extractive, that academics go and mine the data that they need and leave, not without exception, but by and large that is how it's happened. And I do think it's a tremendously missed opportunity for academics to contribute to social movements and to reconstruct themselves as people who helped us craft ideas, but also contribute to struggle in a very real way. And in many ways, I think this is the big distinction between the intellectuals on our continent and that in Latin America, for example. So if we look at the history of MST and the significant contribution thinkers in Latin America made to the formation of that movement, there's just no equivalent on the African continent. We have to really engage independently with what academia does, which is quite separate from movements and civil society in general. The very last point I want to make is about the actual policy agenda. And again, here, I think we've been largely responsive to what government sits on the table. So if we take CADEP, for example, it presents a tremendous opportunity. We can't be stroppy about it and not engage. But the limitations of responding to a government agenda is exactly that government sets a policy agenda based on what it conceives of as a priority. So I do think that part of the struggle around policy engagement is about setting the agenda in a very powerful way through struggle led by movements. Because if we don't do that, then, for example, in my country, the question of women's land rights would never see the light of day. Government, it simply doesn't feature as a factor in their consciousness, whereas women have understood for a long time that the question of prioritizing land for women, it should be a crucial policy discussion, which we're not having because simply through struggle, it's not been pushed as a primary policy discussion. So the conversations we're having is the CADEPs, it's the things that are on the table put by government already, which limits how radical a policy process can be. Thank you, I'll stop there.
Good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen. As already introduced, my name is Tamani Nkhono Mvula, and I work for the Civil Society Agriculture Network, and I come from the warm heart of Africa in Malawi. Well, in Malawi, I can proudly say that we have one of the vibrant civil societies in this part of Africa. This civil society movement started mainly in the early 90s. That was on the onset of multi-party democracy, and there were a number of thematic civil society organizations that have been formed ever since. And my organization mainly looks on issues of agriculture and also agricultural policy as one of the central themes. However, during this period from 1994 up to probably today, I think one of the challenges that we have been seeing or facing is the lack of clarity of definition as to who is the civil society. As a civil society leader myself, I've been asked this question a number of times. And I've tried to explain who the civil society is, but of course that question keeps on coming. And I believe also that is probably also a question which some of us here are asking, who is the civil society? I remember at one time, the late president for Malawi called civil society as the evil society. So the question that we are having probably that we need to understand before we can start debating what our role is probably to understand as to who is this civil society. And now when I was checking some of the documents that I have, I came across a definition, which I'm not sure whether we will agree with it or not. I think that is the subject to discussion. It's a definition that was made by the United Nations Economic Commission, Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. It says, civil society is a group of free, voluntary, non-profit making organizations which occupy the space between the family and the state in order to achieve interest of individuals. And it says that this group of organization of individuals is mainly driven by ethical values. And I believe that probably from this definition, some of us here will now start looking at civil society not as them, but will start looking at civil society as us. And as he probably will be discussing here, it's not a matter of what you are doing, but what we are doing and what we are supposed to do. Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Augustin Loada. I come from Burkina Faso. So my remarks will begin with the same question. What do we mean by civil society organization? I think it's important for us to identify what we mean by civil society, because based on Burkina experience, I can say that there are plenty organizations created by political parties and government, and I wonder if we should call them civil society organization. And one important element is independence or autonomy from government. So for me, it's important to take into account this element. Blessing mentioned two roles civil society organization can play: engaging in policy dialogue and mobilizing groups. I think the first role civil society organization can play depends on their credibility and capacity to play, to engage in this policy dialogue. And I wonder if all civil society organizations has this capacity and credibility to do so. And I also noticed that in Burkina case, in Khaled process, civil society organizations are involved in policy dialogue when donors insist insist that they be part of the process. So there is a lack of will from our governments to imply civil society organization. As far as the second role is concerned about sensitizing, mobilizing, I think in many countries, like in Burkina, governments are reluctant to let civil society organizations play this role because they perceive it as a threat. And I would like to mention a third role civil society organizations play in Burkina in agriculture field. For example, there is a National Union for Cotton Producers in Burkina, which is one of the most important civil society organization group in agriculture field. And it plays what I would call a third role as a professional body, giving services to producers, bargaining cotton price with the cotton companies, and I think they are responsible for management of credits. And it was set up by the government and cotton producer with a clear intention not to let them become a trade union. So I also mentioned that, I would like to mention that this union is also a shareholder of the cotton companies. So this union has to balance contradictory interests between representing producers and playing the role the cotton companies want it to play. So there is a kind of contradiction, and this raises a lot of criticism from producers and allow dissident voices to criticize this kind of civil society organization. So for me, it's very important to identify what we mean by civil society organization. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Arilson Favareto. Excuse me for torture you a little more with my English, but my role here is to talk about the Brazilian experience in terms of civil society. In this 5 minutes, I'd like to talk about 3 or 4 questions concerning the Brazilian experience. The first is we need to unpack the idea of Brazilian civil society. As you know, civil society is a general concept, but we have, in fact, 5 or 6 important sectors of civil society acting on rural or agrarian issues in Brazil today. The most traditional sector is the rural social movements, but with a strong differentiation between the rural social movements in Brazil today. The landless movement, for example, concentrated in agrarian issues, the rural trade unionism concentrated in agricultural policies, and etc. In other words, there is a high diversity of rural social movements in Brazil today, with different discourses and emphasis. We have also a rising importance of the environmental social movements in Brazil. One of the main issues concerning Brazilian agriculture is concerning its environmental impacts. And for this reason, environmental social movements are more and more important. Today, the most important civil society organization acting on Brazilian agricultural issues are the entrepreneurial organizations. This is a new situation because traditionally the entrepreneurial or the big owners organizations are very, very conservative, but in the recent years, the entrepreneurial organizations in Brazil are modernizing the discourse and the forms of action. And this is a very delicate situation we have today. We have also an important set of NGOs acting both on environmental or agrarian issues. And we have also an important role played by academics or by the universities in Brazil, mainly to legitimize discourses or narratives about Brazilian agriculture. And then the first idea is that under the idea of the Brazilian civil society, we have today a diversity of organizations, and more than this, we have a fragmentation of the discourses about Brazilian agriculture. The second important idea, I think, is that civil society has played an important, major role in agricultural policy making in Brazil in all the key moments of our history. In the 70s, with the moment to stop the claims for agrarian reform, naturally a conservative bias of civil society at those moments. After, in the 90s, with the rising of the family farming policies, also in the 90s with the policies in the Mercosul strategy, and today also discussing what agriculture we want in Brazil. There is today a strong fight around what policies for what rural development strategy. The idea is that our success in agricultural development doesn't lead us to necessarily to rural development. And then there is today a public discussion about the differentiation between agricultural policies and rural development policies. And last, I'd like to emphasize that in all these key moments of agricultural policy making in Brazil, it was not one organization or one type of organization, but coalitions acting what had success. In all the key moments, a broad coalition, it was necessary to mobilize different resources necessary to social pressure, to scientific legitimacy, political viability, bureaucratic adherence, or to combining different interests. It can also counterbalance limitations as the low level of education among rural population or the lack of sensibility of urban population to rural issues. Exactly for this reason, there is no opposition between better policies or strengthening civil society in Brazil. There is a permanent policy-making process, and we have a lot of fields of cooperation interesting to the dialogue between Brazil and Africa, or Brazil or Latin American countries and Africa, concerning strategies of social organization, both in productive and political aspects, public policies and programs, rules of cooperation, priorities, funds, etc., interchanging experiences, and the creation of participatory spaces in the governance structure of cooperation and integration between the countries. Thank you.
Thank you for your opening remarks. Arilson, we'll leave you for a moment. We didn't want to concentrate, to focus on our African civil society, and thereafter I think you will offer your reflections on what they are going to discuss. Certainly a number of issues have come up. Civil society has to get out of its comfort zones. Secondly, I think there's a whole debate about what we mean by civil society. Are we talking about an evil society? Maybe from the few remarks that you have made, there are some traits of evilness. But also, I think the whole question of the involvement of the academia in propping up civil society. I think Fatima identified that, and it has been reinforced by the observation from Brazil. But more importantly, I think the observation coming from Brazil is about coalitions. Having said this, guys, what would you describe as the internal and the external challenges that civil society organizations in Africa face when they attempt to engage with the agricultural policy processes? Fatima, you have 3 minutes, and then in that order.
Well, I think the challenges we face will take more than 3 minutes. No, it's quite significant. But from my work in the sector, our biggest challenge is about connection and coordination between civil society. I think contrary to the critique that civil society is weak, there's quite an extensive network of organizations on our continent. The weakness is the link between the two and the fact that we're not reinforcing the messages between organizations, between NGOs and movements. So I really think we have to invest much more extensively in building those connections. I also think that on the African continent, there's an unfair pressure on us to reproduce the scale of movements that exist in Latin America or in Asia for that matter. I think we must be realistic and say that those movements were built in a completely different historical era, a different configuration of forces existed, and we do live in a very new era. We have a new historical moment with it, new challenges, new opportunities as well. But maybe MST is not possible on the African continent. Maybe what we must do is take those 4 or 5 regional land rights movements that we have and focus on depth, focus on strengthening women's leadership, which is non-existent in all of those movements, and then about a continental coordination, because by and large we still operate within the colonially constructed borders. So the English continent countries talk together, the Francophones, the Maghreb, and so on, whereas the reality is that the challenges that face us often transcend these colonially constructed regions. So there is an important challenge for us in that regard. And then, of course, the perennial challenge of funding and donors, and our donors define that agenda. So I don't know if that conversation is ever going to go anywhere, but it's still worth noting that by and large, there is significant pressure from donors that pushes civil society in one direction or the other based on their perception of what is a given priority on the continent at any time. So it is a conversation about power and politics that I think we must keep having, even though I'm not sure what the solution is. Thanks.
Maybe before I go to answering your question, I think there is also one other important role which the civil society plays or should be playing, which is the framing and the reframing of the policy questions. I believe that this is the basis for policy advocacy, because as civil society, our major role is to make sure that the policies that are being developed, they are responding to the needs of our constituency, which in most cases, they are the smallholder farmers, which is the category of people that do not necessarily have the space to speak in policy processes. So the civil society is there to speak for them, but also to provide space for them to be able to speak. So understanding the narratives that sector or that players and actors are saying, and be able to frame the policy question to respond to the needs of the voiceless. I think that is also one of the major roles which the civil society plays in policy processes. Now, on the challenges, as she has already pointed out, there are a number of challenges that the civil society are facing. And I think most of the things which I had jotted down, she has already pointed them out. But one of the things which I should also point out is the general issue of intimidation, right? Of course, let's say, for example, if I give an example for Malawi, the last few months of the late president's time, there was that high level intimidation towards the civil society. So it was difficult for the civil society to be able to constructively engage with the government on issues that are affecting or that were affecting the rural masses. But also there is generally an issue of mistrust between the civil society and government. One of the roles that probably we also do is the issue of monitoring of how resources are being used in the sector, in the agriculture sector. So for one to be able to get information on how resources are being used, it has been a very big challenge to do that. And all these things, I think, it's emanating from the fact that the civil society and the government, or the civil society and those or those who are looting, there is that lack of mistrust. They ask questions: what are you going to use this information for, and something like that. So it's that issue of lack of mistrust and intimidation, which I also think is one of the major challenges which we are facing. Thank you.
Okay. I think there are several challenges. I would like to stress some of them. I think one of the challenges would be the freedom of association. In many countries, there is an attempt from the government to control civil society groups. So it's very difficult for some citizens to create free association. So it's, for me, one of the challenges. Another challenge is information. If you don't have access to information, for example, for cotton producers, if you don't know how prices are set up, it's very difficult for them to define their interests. So lack of information, access to information is a challenge. And I think resources are also a key element. Many civil society groups have not sufficiently access to human resources, including expertise on agricultural fields, and of course, financial material resources. So it's one of the challenges we can identify. Another challenge is the lack of opportunities for dialogue, policy dialogue. As I mentioned previously, if there is no political will to involve civil society groups, we won't get opportunity to discuss and negotiate with the government. And yeah, that's all.
Guys, I'm overwhelmed with the list of challenges that you have highlighted. It seems it's all challenges, challenges, challenges. With these challenges, should we still look up to you, civil society, to provide any engagement, meaningful engagement in the agricultural policy processes? I would like you to reflect on this question, focusing very much on the political dimension of the challenges that you have highlighted.
Okay, so I want to go back to the point I raised right at the beginning, and the question is, who are we talking about when we say civil society? And I do think a large part of the challenge is located there. So it's back to the question of NGOs and civil society organizations. And I think here we must look back at our history of engaging our governments and identify the moments we've been very successful. And it has been the moments where we've engaged in dual processes of formally being inside the formal policy processes, but also having masses outside on the street. Government doesn't take NGOs seriously because they know that we can muster a moment of indignation in Parliament on the given day, and then our lives continues. There are intangible implications for the livelihoods of NGO workers when things happen or they don't. But that's not the case for movements of farmers, for example. And those are the kind of people who can sustain a struggle because it literally has life and death implications in their livelihoods. And government understands that very powerfully, and which is why they repeatedly question our legitimacy. Now, I don't think we should indulge the conversation about our legitimacy. We must argue very strongly that in a democratic landscape, in a vision where democracy requires an active citizenry, NGOs are legitimate expressions of civil society and have an important role to play. But I think politically we must be realistic about our capacity to drive and lead long-term sustainable change, which is why I think NGOs must legitimate themselves by contributing to the building of social movements. And it's only through that kind of engagement with policy spaces. I mean, look back at our history. The major victories we've won, I look at my own country, the most significant victory we've won in a post-apartheid era has been around ARVs, in government's commitment to providing that on scale to everyone who's HIV positive. And that could never have been attained if the Treatment Action Campaign was a small NGO without a base. The most significant victories have been those where there's been partnership between people who think about things, the intellectuals who drive it in partnership with a significant base. And I think until that penny drops for us in the agricultural sector, governments will engage NGOs on their terms because we don't have the power to push them beyond their conversations. Thank you.
Well, I think civil society is very relevant. And because when you are talking of policy making, I think that there is now a general consensus that policy making is not just a rational process, but it's much of a political process. And if we are to have policies that are responding to the needs of those affected, then I think the issue of participation of those the affected will be very, very important. And the civil society plays that role of making sure that the space is provided for those that are not able to participate in policy processes. I think that is what makes the civil society to be very relevant. Of course, we have been talking here of challenges that we are facing. These are the challenges that are affecting us not to be as effective as we should have been. Now, if most of these challenges are addressed, I think the civil society will be able to play their rightful role. In a much democratic setup, I think the civil society is probably the only space or the only channel through which the marginalized will be able to voice their concerns. And in a situation which is not very democratic, I think civil society is an instrument which can be used to pressure governments, to pressure the ruling elites, so that the democratic values are implemented. We can take, for example, the Arab Spring. We can see that the work of the civil society helped to create a much more democratic setup. So I think the civil society is still relevant. It's only that probably there are a number of challenges that we are facing, which needs to be addressed, which of course we can share ideas on how those challenges needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Some of the challenges we mentioned, I think, reflect political economic challenges. For example, poverty, lack of human and financial resources, and attempt of the government to control civil society organizations, weaken civil society, and this decrease the pressure civil society can have on government to deliver better policy. And I think it's still relevant to build capacity within civil society to increase political incentive for better agricultural policy. If we build capacity so that civil society can demand more from the government, I think it will be still relevant.
I hear you guys. And one of the things that came up in the discussion so far, that has come up in the discussion so far, is the double-edged face of the donors. On one hand, you look up to them for funding. On the other hand, you are arguing that they dictate what you ought to be doing, and that limits your room for maneuver. I was just wondering whether you could, in very specific terms, state what you, one or two things, what you think donors could do in order to improve civil society, civil society's role in engaging with agricultural policy processes.
Well, I work for ActionAid, and we occupy this ambiguous space of being an NGO that engages in advocacy work, but also fund local NGOs in our country. So I speak a bit from both sides. I think the important thing, I mean, my historical challenge has been that donors are reluctant to get into the area of social movement building. And I know that in every response I've made, I've been talking about social movements just because I think what we're trying to do is impossible without strong social movements. And the challenge around it is that you cannot fit a social movement construction into a log frame to start off with. You can't plot it very neatly. There isn't a timeline. It's a much more organic process than organizing a policy-making workshop. So that's the one thing. The other norm, I think, certainly for donors in South Africa, is that people construct their country analysis where they sit in the north without engagement or with very little engagement with people on the ground in the country. So donors would come up with a contextual analysis and identification of priority areas for funding for South Africa without South Africans having a voice in that. I think that is highly problematic because it is an extension of an historical process in which people look out from the outside and decide for us what they think our major problems are. I don't think that's useful. I think there must be a conversation in country and there must be a level of accountability because the political conversation with donors is about why the money is in the north. So I know no one wants to hear about colonialism anymore, but the reality is the reason why the money is coming from the north to the south is an accident of colonial history. If things were different, we could be sitting here deciding what gets funded to Germany or to the UK. So the fact that the money is there is just, it's not because there's more brains or more intellectual capital or better understanding of the world or more clarity about what needs to be done. It's just an outcome of history. And so there shouldn't be a superiority that comes with that money, which I think is underneath the conversation and why the decision-making around how that money flows and to whom it flows is located in the north by and large. So I know internally my organization is having a very difficult conversation about where decisions are made about money, regardless of where it comes from. And I think that is the political conversation we have to have with donors. It's very difficult for NGOs to have that conversation when we are dependent on the money flowing. So again, I think it's an important contribution academics can make. I know increasingly also dependent on donors for your own livelihoods. But in a sense, there's a limitation to how radical civil society can be in the conversation with donors because the truth is it has consequences. I know from my experience in South Africa, if you speak too loudly to a donor, if you're too honest, if you're too politically radical, you can't track you. Thank you.
Well, I think for now, the civil society, being non-profit making, will still need the donors for resources. Let's say, for example, myself, I'm here. I don't know what's paid for my air ticket. But there is a donor, somebody who has made it possible for me to be here. So I think for in the medium term, we still need the resources from the donors for us to be able to do our work properly. Most of the challenges that we highlighted, you see that most of them are based on the fact that we don't have much resources to engage. All these challenges could be, that would be the basis. So I think for now, we should say that as a civil society organization, we'll still depend on donors for support. But also, the donors could help us in terms of building the capacity, the analytical and also negotiating skills, which are very much critical in our work. For us to be able to understand some of these things, the policy processes, and how to engage in policy processes, I think we'll still need the support of the donors for us to do that. But also the other thing which I can also point out is the donors may help in linking the southern CSOs to international alliances, right? And also international platforms. Let's say, for example, such of these platforms, some of us were very much probably linked to international platforms through the initiatives that the donors play. But also, donors could also be a source of information, because as civil society, we depend quite a lot on evidence if we are to engage with government or within the policy process. So I think the donors have also been very much helpful in providing information for evidence for us to engage in dialogue with the government. Thank you.
Okay, I think part of the response to the challenges we mentioned can be found within the country. I think it's important for civil society groups to increase their political capital in terms of leadership, credibility, legitimacy, and improving communication within civil society organization. Of course, the funds are key, but in my country, government funds trade unions, but this doesn't prevent them to do their work. So the government has a responsibility to fund also civil society groups. Of course, donors can play a role. Based on Burkina experience, I would say that, I can say that in CADEP process, civil society would have missed an opportunity to interact with government if donors didn't insist. So donors can urge governments to reinforce or create platform of dialogue for engaging civil society in policy dialogue.
I can see that there is clearly a love-hate relationship between the donors and the civil society. Arilson, I noted that throughout the proceedings, you were listening attentively. Now it's your turn to offer a 5-minute reflection on what these guys have been saying. Is there any hope for civil society in Africa to engage meaningfully in the agricultural policy processes? Of course, as a learning continent, we are very keen to hear some of the lessons, if any, from Brazil.
I have no idea about this. I have said in the first day that we have no model of agriculture in Brazil, but an interesting and mainly contradictory experience. The same I can say with civil society. The situation is very difficult, and then it's not easy to talk about the African reality since the Brazilian experience. What I could say is that in our history we have faced 3 challenges, and I think that even with the difference of context, the same challenges are present in today's African reality. The first is a challenge that concerns to the organizational dimension. That is, there are some challenges concerning how to do social mobilization, how to achieve freedom of organization, and etc. And then one field of preoccupation and social investment should be an organizational dimension. Surely there is hope for civil society in Africa, but mainly the hope of the future of agriculture in the world and also in Africa depends on civil society, and then organizational dimension is very, very important. A second field, a second challenge we have faced in Brazilian history, and I think also is present in African situations today, is what I call a discursive dimension. We have constructed in Brazil a narrative discourse about our agriculture. We have a lot of differences, we have a lot of contradictions, we have a lot of different views about this, but we can say that there is an official, a public vision, a public discourse about the success of the Brazilian agriculture, constructed on some Brazilian specificities. The same, and this is very interesting for our discussion, the same is happening today in other Latin American countries. I think the situation today in countries like Bolivia or Ecuador is near to the challenges the African countries are facing today. They are trying to establish a specific view about what is their vision of agriculture to the future. And this is different, very, very different of the Brazilian reality. And then I think a second important challenge for all the countries, the South countries, is a discursive dimension about what agriculture for what future. And the third and final field or dimension is the institutional dimension. This is very, very different because the situation of state in Brazil and some national states in Africa is obviously different, but it's a very important dimension, always be an important dimension to construct the future of agriculture. In spite of the difficulties or fragilities or contradictions, we need to construct a positive discourse to affirm this specific model of rural development, or to construct rules to be the policy-making process more transparent, or to make the policy-making process more open to the participation or civil society. And then, in spite of the differences of context between Africa, Brazil, or Bolivia, Ecuador, and other Latin American countries, I think that these three fields, the organizational, the discursive, and the institutional dimension, are three important fields to collaborate and to invest our social efforts in the future.
Thank you, guys, for such a stimulating discussion. I have no doubt that the discussion so far has whetted enough appetite. I did see that some of you were sitting on the edges of your chairs wanting to jump in. This is the time. Fred? Hannington?
First?
Fred? Yeah. Fred?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name's Frederick Goroba Mtevi. I'm Ugandan. I'm affiliated with the Africa Power and Politics program at the ODI. I would like to be a little provocative in posing my questions and making my comments. The first one is, where do we have evidence of success in agriculture policy making in which civil society groups have played a key role? And if we have that evidence, what role is it that they played? In a way, this is almost all posing the same question about democracy and bottom-up pressure. I think that we accept these things a little too easily sometimes. We don't ask questions. I would like somebody to enlighten me about that. Relations between CSOs and governments. What's the best kind of relationship? Collaboration, contestation? Is there a template that you can say, well, CSOs should work like this with governments and it's the only way they succeed? Or is this context specific? Lastly, I heard somebody say, well, CSOs are interested in asking governments about how they spend their money and where they spend it, which is a very good thing. In one of the countries where I work, the shoe is on the other foot. The government asks CSOs about where they spend their money, and they don't like it. They protest and present that as an attempt by government to control them, and they say there is something wrong with that. In the same country, the government says, okay, you complain about having no resources, we are proposing to fund you. And again, CSOs run away from this. They say, oh, no, this is an attempt to control us because we want to be independent. The question for me is it better to be funded by foreigners, by foreign donors? And if it's better, why is it better? Thank you.
There you go.
My name is Hannington Odame. I'm from Kenya. I'll follow up on Freddie's question. Scholars in governance say that there is a difference between debate and dialogue. And sometimes we, we use these two terms interchangeably. In terms of debate, people say it is talk at each other in a very simple way. But in dialogue, you engage each other, listen to each other with a particular, maybe sometimes reaching a consensus. From your own experiences, what are the indicators when you say we have done enough debating, we should move to dialogue? And is there a difference the way Brazil does it compared to the way we do it in Africa? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amy Tekia from Dahlak Films and Wits University here in South Africa. My question is for Mr. Favareto. There's been mention, and I think it's clear, of the gap on the continent and certainly in South Africa between what's happening at universities and some of the intellectual kind of gains and developments on the academic and theoretical level, and what's happening in grassroots movements and even in NGOs. And it seems like there's been more of a connection and a dialogue and a working together in Brazil and Latin America. And I'm just wondering what you think has facilitated that, whether is it formal structures and mechanisms to create that dialogue, or has it just been organically how the movements have grown and who's been involved?
Ben Cousins from PLUS. It's a question for Fatima. She's raised the question of the relationship between civil society, NGOs, and academics. It's also what the previous question is about. I think our experience at PLUS in South Africa is that often there's distrust of academics by NGOs. On the other hand, academic researchers are often somewhat wary of the kind of simplified messages, if you like, strategic essentialism, which NGO and civil society organizations engaging in as part of their advocacy and campaigning. So it seems like it's not necessarily an easy relationship. And again, I'd be interested in the Brazilian kind of comparison here. But what do you think are the reasons for the distrust of academics by civil society movements? And are there issues which are particularly the case in South Africa with regards to questions of ideology or race, for that matter? And how can we go forward on this? I think it's a key issue because I would suggest to civil society organizations that if a better analysis of complexity could help inform more effective strategies In yesterday's session on South African agricultural policy, your intervention was that the notion that large-scale commercial farmers are somewhat differentiated, that they're not all the same, is not particularly useful for activist organizations working around farm wages, because all farmers are experienced as exploitative. But I wonder if that's really true. I mean, in the recent research by Barrientos and FISA on table grapes, it's suggested that actually it's the more successful farms, larger, more successful, more profitable farms, even those are struggling. But really the question is what's the situation on the less successful farms? So even in that context, is it not important to differentiate between different kinds of farmers? And again, academic analysis might help inform more effective organizing and strategizing. But some reflections on how we can improve these relationships would be useful.
Thank you very much. Heike Hoffler from GIZ. I was just wanting to follow up on the question, who is the civil society? And I've been actually looking at the title of the conference and the plenary session again, and I'm wondering why there's so little talk about farmers' organizations as civil society organizations, or probably there's. So my question to all panelists is, what role do you see for farmers' organization, national farmers' organization as well as regional farmer organization in, as the title of the panel suggested, enhancing agriculture policy? And do you have any experience with cases where farmer organizations had the capacity to engage effectively in policy process? And the reason I'm asking is that, for example, under CADEP, they put a lot of emphasis on these particular regional farmers' organizations in Africa. And I would like to get your opinion on how you think that's going to work and whether that's an effective type of civil society mechanisms. Thanks.
There are lots and lots of questions, so I would like to ask you to be very brief so that we can have an opportunity for a second round of questions. I think we'll go in that order.
Going in this order. Okay. I think there's quite a lot of, thank you for very interesting questions. I'm going to start with Frederick and your long list of difficult questions. I think there is evidence of successful engagement around policy issues, not completely, I think, but there are incidents where there has been victories around specific policy objectives. No? And I think there isn't a template. It does depend on the context, and I do think we need to engage in, as I've argued before, a combination of strategies. So in some cases, we have to see government as our partners in the areas where we agree on things. And in other cases, what we're trying to do is quite radical. Our vision, you know, the notion of agrarian reform is at its heart about politics, because if we understand access to natural resources as the basis, not only for livelihoods, but also the basis of social and political power, then that doesn't happen without contestation. So there's a variation across our continent about whose interests governments represent. And I think in the South African instance, where the feeling is that government represents the interests by and large of big business, despite political rhetoric to the contrary, there is a fierce political struggle, and it's not a nice and a diplomatic one. On occasion, we sit together and we talk about things, but in other cases, it's going to be a fight. So I think we have to be strategic about what we're fighting about and choose the methodology accordingly. I'm going to say something very briefly about academia, and Ben used to be my professor, so he's got the rights to challenge me in the way that he does from the floor. I think the first part of the process, Ben, is an open conversation, which we've never had. So I think you're absolutely right. The levels of distrust between the movements, NGOs, and civil society and the academia is significant. I think race is a part of it. The other part of it is feeling that academics are researching just what they are interested in, and that there isn't a link between the academic research agenda and what movements feel is relevant to their struggles. So maybe there needs to be a much more structured conversation. In a sense, first at TRC, let's put things on the table and say where this distrust comes from. And this is a very South Africa-specific conversation. And then the other issues around simplification, if you engage in advocacy work, there is a level of simplification that is functional to making a media headline or getting a government minister to hear you. So you can't differentiate between farmers if you want government to focus on what farmers are doing to farm workers, whether you think it's inaccurate or not. And I think we're going to disagree about whether that's ethical or whether that's useful, but the reality is, in my experience of doing advocacy work, that is what works. And there is space for variation and graduation in other levels of conversation, but certainly not in the headlines of campaign work. And in the very last, I'm sorry I didn't hear your name. When I was talking about social movements all along, I'm talking about farm worker movements, movements of farmers in our continent. And I do think there's a very crucial space for farmers to be in the conversation. And I don't think, again, the question is not how effective have they been or whether they are effectively capacitated. It is about problematizing the policy-making process itself, because the process itself is set up in a certain way that it privileges a certain skill set that farmers don't have in abundance. So by definition, they come to the table disadvantaged to participate in that conversation. And I really think, as I said before, I think academics have a contribution to make. The academics who specialize in participatory methodologies. My government always claims that it's engaged in participatory policy-making process, and what they really mean is they'll place an ad in the newspaper and you'll know that there will be a conversation about a certain policy. It's your responsibility to get yourself prepared, to wade through 100 pages of their draft thinking on a policy, get yourself to the venue, and then participate on those terms. So it's just set up in a way that means that farmers' voices in the agricultural policy discussion is marginalized, and I'm not convinced that in CADEP we've crafted a different way, even though it represents a great opportunity. So there's a very specific niche that academics who are engaged in this area should just take up and say that this is what we can offer the CADEP process, a different kind of thinking about how we have policy discussions. Because if the methodology is different in a very Freudian way, then the outcomes can be radically different too. Thank you.
Thanks. Of course, there was no specific question directed to me, but I will just attempt to answer some of the questions that were raised, and my colleagues are going to add to whatever I'm going to say. The first speaker, of course, asked of the evidence of any policy change that has taken place, and also what role did the civil society play in that process. Well, there could be a number of examples that we can point out, but I think the most important thing to understand is that a policy outcome is as a result of contributions for a number of players that are involved in those processes. And at the end of the day, it's not an issue of attribution, but it's an issue of contribution. We can see that some course of action was taken because of some level of contribution which the civil society contributed. So it may be difficult somehow to point out as to say this is what we did, but we may say that this policy outcome we have to some extent or to a great extent contributed. And also the other thing that also needs to be understood is that the role of the civil society is not only to change policy or to influence policy, but it's also to influence the way of thinking, the attitudes. We are also there to influence the practices that are there. So sometimes the government or the policy makers may not do something because of the presence of the civil society. So the civil society themselves, they may not say something, but because of their presence, the government may be forced to do the right things. So in such a context, we may not say that we did ABC for government to do X, Y, Z, but the government did what they did because of the presence of the civil society. So it's an issue of how much we have contributed to the process. But if I could give a specific example for Malawi, In 2005, Malawi developed the Food and Nutrition Security Policy, which looked at issues of food security and also issues of nutrition. But of course, there was an outcry from the nutritionist that if the issues of nutrition are handled by the Minister of Agriculture, there is a likelihood that such issues of nutrition may be ignored, because the policy was looking at both food security and nutrition. So as civil society, we stood together with the nutritionist, and we saw the policy being split. A nutritional policy was developed, a separate policy, and also a food security policy was developed. So to some extent, we can say that we contributed to that thinking. We contributed to that split of the policy to have two separate policies of nutrition and also of food security. But in general, I think it's an issue of contribution, not attribution. And the other problem, which, of course, the one who asked the question had, was only the fact that the civil society were there on the neck of government as to how are you using the money, how are you using the resources. But when the government wants to look at how we are using the resources, we are mostly resistant. Of course, that has been the trend, and is mostly the trend. But of course, that is coming from the fact that the government uses public resources. That's the first thing. And the government is supposed to be accountable to the people. Government is supposed to answer on how it is using the taxes that it gets from the people. So on that basis, we ask government to be accountable. But now, when it comes to the civil society, there have been situations where we have done campaigns, but those that supported the campaigns, they requested that they don't want to be known. They have the passion for the cause to see a change in a certain process, but they make a request that we don't want to be seen. So in such a situation, if you force the civil society to mention who funded this and who is funding you and all those, I think sometimes it's a bit a challenge on us. As we already said, that our existence is mainly on the goodwill of the donors. Now, if we start going maybe sometimes against the request of whosoever funded us, the challenge is where are we going to get the resources next time? So there have been such situations. But as the CISANET, my organization, we do audits of our accounts every year, and the documents are available for anyone. If the government wants to see our audited accounts, the audited accounts are available. But of course, there are also other situations where we are requested not to mention who has funded us on any campaign that we are doing. And on our refusal to accept funding from government, well, I've not had such type of an experience. As a matter of fact, we have, in most cases, worked together with the government. There has been times when we received funding from government for joint policy dialogues. We have done work together with the government where we contributed and also government put in some resources. There has been such situations. And also, there are moments when we even requested the government for resources, but the government did not give us the resources. Erika yesterday was talking about, in her presentation, she talked about the ASWAP, the Agriculture Sector-Wide Approach. The ASWAP has a project called the ASWAP SP, the support program. This program was supposed to strengthen the players, those that signed the compact, so that they are able to effectively implement the ASWAP. But the resources that went to the ASWAP, all of them, they benefited the government. They never benefited some of us. We have been trying to get resources from this project, but we never receive a part of those. So there are moments when we have worked with government, we have received funding from government, but also we have even requested government for resources, but resources never came. Thank you.
Okay. I think there is a place for farmer organizations within civil society. If we define civil society as groups or organizations between household, state, and private sector. In Burkina case, in the process of CADEP, we have a national peasant organization which played an important role in the process, in the policy dialogue, and they put on the table the issue of land grab and small farm, and the issue were taken into account in the formulation of the national program for rural sector, and I think it can be seen as one of the success of the CADEP process. I think government can fund civil society. In Burkina, government fund media, trade unions, and political parties. And I think it's legitimate because it's our money. So I don't think a civil society organization should refuse to be funded by the government. Of course, I know that some government may use this to control civil society organization, but I think what I would advise is to diversify. If you count only on government or only on donors, for me it's the same weakness. So it's important to diversify fundings. Of course, civil society are not, they have their own weaknesses. So we cannot say civil society is the solution to agriculture problems, but civil society organizations are actors. They are citizens, so they have their say in policy dialogue. So for me, it's not a matter of panacea. It's just civil society. It's just citizens organized who want to voice and promote their interests. Yeah.
Two comments. One first more general comment is that in Brazilian history, and I think the same happens in other Latin American countries, the main opposition is not between collaboration or contestation. We have moments yesterday under the neoliberal governments and today under the Workers' Party governments, moments of contestation and moments of collaboration. The real opposition, I think, is between a reactive behavior, a reactive discourse, and an affirmative action or discourse. And to put this discourse in the public arena, sometimes we need contestative actions, and in some moments, collaborative actions. It depends, as I said, not only about the state, but it depends on the identities of social movements. It depends on the networks mobilized in social action and etc. The second comment is about what could facilitate collaboration between the scientific world, the universities, and grassroots movements. According to the Brazilian experience, we have two main instruments to do it. One is the structures created by social movements with the support of international cooperation. Two examples. We have the Florestan Fernandes Institute, created by the Landless Movement. It is an important space for training, for reflection involving the social movements, leaderships, and sociologists, economists, and etc. We have another very, very interesting experience in Brazil, the Department of Economic and Social Rural Studies, created by the family farmers trade unions in the 80s. we have today a lot of officials working, for example, in the Ministry of Agrarian Development, originally from this NGO in southern Brazil. And then one first structure is this kind of organizations created by social movements to produce training and studies and etc. Other is several formal research and training programs with shared coordination between academics and social movements. This is important because it's not a unilateral program. It's not a demand from social movements answered by academics, and also is not a question of to deliver scientific knowledge to social movements. The key word here is shared coordination of research and training programs. But most important than the structures, formal structures, programs, or organizations created is the disposition of a part of the academic world in Brazil and the social movements to a permanent dialogue. This is important to form the coalitions, as I have said in the first moment of this panel, stable coalitions working on issues of interest of both academics and social movements.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have an opportunity for a second round of questions, given the intensity of the questions that came through in the first round. But as a way of summing up, I think you can agree with me that this has been a very stimulating discussion. I think several issues have emerged. Civil society organizations in Africa do face internal and contextual challenges that they have to negotiate with in order to be meaningful players in the agricultural policy processes. But also, more importantly, I think there's this enduring theme of the love and hate relationship between civil society and donors. It seems they cannot do without donors, but they have to engage donors in a way that would help them to be meaningful players in the agricultural policy processes. Another more important theme that has emerged, I think, is the relationship between academics and civil society. And I think this, for me, is the main lesson that as FAC probably we need to take home. I think we will need going forward to explore ways and means of how we can forge meaningful partnerships with the civil societies, with the idea of capacitating them or learning from them on how we can do proper agricultural research. And I think this lesson has also been emphasized from Brazil. Of course, from Brazil, we have had so many lessons, the issues of institutional organization, the issues of how to overcome collective action problems, et cetera, et cetera. At this point, I think I would like to ask the rest of you to join me in thanking the panelists for such a wonderful discussion. Thank you.